Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, good evening and thank you for coming. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you to the Besterman Lecture for 2024. All I have to say is that the Besterman Lecture is the big annual event of the Voltaire Foundation. We're commemorating Theodore Besterman, whose bequest to Oxford to found the foundation is now exactly 50 years old. So there's a good reason to have a celebratory lecture. And this lecture has been running for now more than 25 years. And it's fantastic that tonight we have Cécile Vidal who's going to give the lecture. However, Greg, who I think was a graduate student, I think with Cécile long ago, would like to introduce her. And so I'm now going to hand over to Greg, but thank you for coming. And there will be time for questions afterwards. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm Gregory Brown, Senior Research Fellow at the Voltaire Foundation. And it is a great honor and privilege to introduce Cécile. Cécile Vidal is Professor, Directeur d'études formally, but Professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. She has formerly been Visiting Research Fellow here in Oxford at the Maison Française d'Oxford in the fall of 23, and earlier this year was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She is a social historian of colonial empires, works on the slave trade and slavery in the Atlantic world from the 17th to the 19th century. She began her career in colonial history with a thesis on French colonial implantation in North America, in the Illinois country, which up until that point had really not been studied. She did a thesis in 1995. And then moved on to broader scholarship. She is the author of a widely read and widely cited sort of survey of French Atlantic history, Histoire d'Amérique française, co-authored with Gilles Havard, which is now in its 5th edition, most recently in 2019. And she is the editor of numerous works, of which I'll cite Louisiana, Crossroads of the Atlantic World, which was published in 2013 in the Early American History series of University of Pennsylvania Press. And she is the author of a book that is an absolutely terrific monograph on 18th century New Orleans that is not in translation. She wrote it in English, Caribbean New Orleans, Empire, Race, and the Making of a Slave Society, published by University of North Carolina Press in the series of the Alejandro Institute of Early American History. That book won numerous awards, including the Research Prize of the Society for French American Studies, Association d'études américaines. It also won the Lionel Groulx Prize of the Institut d'Histoire de l'Amérique française. More recently, she is the co-editor of a kind of massive work of scholarship and reference on the history of slavery, Une histoire sociale. There's two works, Une histoire sociale du Nouveau Monde, which was published in 21, and then the same year is this major work on the history of slavery, co-edited with Paulin Ismar and Benedetta Rossi, also published in 2021. She is going to be a co-organizer next spring in June 2025 of a colloquium at the Collège de France entitled Haiti 1825, which will be about the 200th anniversary of the legal recognition of the Republic of Haiti, which is tied to, for those who know the history, the forced reparations payment by the Republic of Haiti to France. Tonight, her lecture is from current research entitled Suicide and Slavery in Enlightenment Thought. Please welcome Cécile Vidal.
Thank you very much, Greg, for this generous introduction. I also would like to thank very much Nicholas Kronk and Avi Lifshitz for their invitation. I feel honored and humbled to have been asked to give the Besterman Lecture of the Voltaire Foundation. In Candide, the account of the old woman's misfortunes include this conclusion on suicide, which is worth quoting in almost its entirety to introduce my point. 100 times I was upon the point of killing myself, but still I loved life. This ridiculous fable is perhaps one of our most fatal characteristics. For is there anything more absurd than to wish to carry continually a burden which one can always throw down, to detest existence and yet to cling to one's existence. In brief, to caress the serpent which devours us till he has eaten our very heart. In the different countries which it has been my lot to traverse, and the numerous inns where I have been servant, I have taken notice of a vast number of people who held their own existence in abhorrence. And yet, I never knew of more than 8 who voluntarily put an end to their miseries. 3 Negroes, 4 Englishmen, and a German professor named Robert. This excerpt reflects one of the 3 parts of Voltaire's position on voluntary death. While he defended the right to kill oneself as a matter of principle and condemned punishment for suicide, he argued that self-killing should be avoided at all costs and that it could not be a response to the vicissitude of the human condition. At the same time, he poked fun at his contemporaries' perception of an increase in the number of suicides in Europe, particularly in England and other Protestant countries. The old woman's ironic enumeration of the individuals and groups affected begins, however, with the mention of, I quote, 3 Negroes. As this list reveals, Enlightenment thinkers were aware of the importance of suicide in the slave trade and slavery. Although the novel includes the famous episode of the runaway in Suriname, Voltaire chose the character of the old woman who had a self-experienced captivity and slavery in the Mediterranean to address the issue of the temptation to commit suicide. Candide is far from the only text in which Voltaire tackles the subject of suicide or that of colonial slavery, but it's the only one, to my knowledge, in which the 2 topics intersect, albeit surreptitiously. Should we attach any significance to the fact that the debate on suicide on the one hand and that on the slave trade and slavery on the other hand are held almost separately in this emblematic text of the Enlightenment? This questioning of the place given to enslaved Africans and their suicidal acts is not just a preoccupation of historians of the 21st century. A case in point is the tale published in 1764 by a minor writer, Gabriel Mayol, under the title Le philosophe nègre et le secret des Grecs, The Negro Philosopher and the Secret of the Greeks. According to Romuald von Kua, this obscure writer belonged to a family of writers appointed, like so many others, by members of the aristocracy, in this case, the Fleury family. However, he was not part of any major intellectual social network. He wrote several rather mediocre and thus unsuccessful plays and novels. Among his works, however, Le philosophe nègre stands out. It has been read at the time as a parody of Candide and can be interpreted as a critique of Voltaire's tale. The character of Candide is played by Tintillot, Prince of Mitombo. The first part of the novel is devoted to the story of his tribulation between not only Africa and the Antilles, but also Europe, perhaps as a way of placing Africans at the heart of European consciousness. It's this African prince who gives the first title to the tale, Le philosophe nègre, an expression that probably appeared as an oxymoron in the eyes of his contemporaries. With this title, the author seemed to be proclaiming that Africans, or at least their princes, could learn to philosophize in the face of the miseries of life. At the start of the novel, the narrator, Monsieur de Virmont, is staying at an inn in Germany. In an adjoining room is a Negro hussar who, in despair, threatens to cut his own throat at any moment. Whereas Voltaire had given the old woman the role of talking about the temptation to commit suicide, Mayol attributed to Tintillot to such an extent that the African is immediately associated with the idea of voluntary death. From chapter 3 to chapter 13, Tintillot himself tells his story. The temptation to commit suicide appears as soon as it's captured and told is to be sold to a European merchant. But the hope of seeing his beloved Bambiche again keeps him alive. The story of the Middle Passage then provides an opportunity to ridicule the way in which enslavers justify the slave trade, referring to the practice of forcing captives to dance on the deck of the ship in order to maintain their physical and mental condition. If he, the French merchant, in order to keep us and be able to earn on our purchases, made us uncomfortable for a while, at least it worked to make it bearable for us. Every day he gave us a concert of instruments and voices and taught us to dance. Some of my comrades learned the minuet, the allemande, and the bourrée, and during the voyage, only 189 of them were found stabbed, suffocated, or hanged. This little trade, as you can see, should give our people a charming idea of the gentleness of European manners and of the humanity that rules your souls. The mention of the 189 suicides on the slave ship sounds like a critical reminder of the 3 Negroes on the old woman list in Voltaire's tale. In Mayol's novel, Once in Martinique, the temptation to commit suicide reappears with the Maroon episode when Tintillot is ready to die heroically to save his master. And then at the end of the story in Lorraine, when serving as a hussar, he fears that he will no longer be recruited into any military company because of his refusal to commit war crimes. Tintillot is finally dissuaded from killing himself when Viremont agrees to take him in his service as an equerry. As in Candide, suicide is an object of derision in Mayol's tales. Its evocation also serves to defend the idea that life should be chosen at all costs. But the fact that the contemplation of suicide is carried by an African prince lives immorally. The episode of the Middle Passage also reveals that there are situations that can lead to epidemics of suicide, despite the instinct of self-preservation that Voltaire believed should prevent such a phenomenon. Above all, the numerous self-killings on the slave ship constitute a major argument against the slave trade. As the confrontation between Candide and le philosophe nègre illuminates, the inclusion of suicide by African slaves in the debate on voluntary death, as well as that on the slave trade and slavery, was not self-evident and was a subject of discussion and contention in the mid-18th century. Yet, the frequency of these acts was a known phenomena that immediately fostered doubts about the morality of the slave trade. It demonstrated the humanity of enslaved people when the slave system sought to dehumanize them. Suicide and slavery similarly question freedom as self-ownership. Yet, few researchers have so far studied the intersection of Enlightenment debate on suicide and slavery. Admittedly, recent studies have shown that British abolitionists made slave suicide one of the major arguments in favor of prohibiting the infamous commerce, but without making the connection with more general discussion on suicide. Moreover, we do not know what happened on the French side. My study of slave suicide in Enlightenment thought forms part of a wider project on suicide in the slave trade and slavery in the British and French empires, between the mid-18th and mid-19th century. So from the concomitant rise of the Atlantic system of slavery and of the anti-slavery movement to the definitive abolition of slavery in these two empires. The book will offer both a comparative and connective history of these two imperial formations and will cover Western Africa, the Middle Passage, 4 Caribbean islands, Barbados and Martinique, Saint-Domingue and Jamaica, as well as the British and French metropoles. The project focuses on the slave suicide while also taking into account those of free people in order to get a better understanding of the particularities of the former. It looks at both suicidal acts and conception and discourses on the phenomenon. In so doing, it aims to contribute to a rearticulation of the relationship between social history and intellectual history. However, I am first and foremost a social historian, not a historian of ideas. I have not spent my career reading Voltaire or Hume, editing and commenting on their works, or studying their sociability. Rather, I have devoted my professional life to thinking about what racial slavery does to society. It's therefore with a great deal of humility that I present to you what is, moreover, still very much a work in progress. The lecture will demonstrate that slave suicide entered Enlightenment reflection on self-destruction and on slavery from the mid-18th century onwards, but it was from the 1770s onwards that they were given greater prominence in the context of the rise of the anti-slavery movement. Yet there were no links between position on suicide and those on slavery. Moreover, the French anti-slavery writers had very different ways of explaining slave suicide and were not entirely immune to race thinking, so that voluntary death did not become one of their major arguments. The importance of suicide in the slave trade and slavery was a phenomenon that was immediately publicized beyond the professional circles involved in such a way that anyone in Europe interested in maritime expansion and the colonial world could not ignore it. Information on the frequency of slave suicide during the Middle Passage was first divulged in technical works on the trade that became bestsellers in the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1675, just as France was beginning to get involved in the transatlantic slave trade, Jacques Savary published Le Parfait Négociant. This manual went through no fewer than 30 editions in French before 1800. Savary wrote about the traffic in human beings. This trade seems inhuman to those who do not know that these poor people are idolaters or Mohammedans, and that Christian merchants, by buying them from their enemies, free them from cruel slavery and enable them to find in the islands to which they are taken not only a gentler servitude, but even the knowledge of the true God. There's reason to believe that without this consideration, this trade will not be allowed. It should be noted that as soon as the Negroes have been traded and are loaded onto the ships, the sail must be set to windward. The reason for this is that the slaves have such a great love for their homeland that they despair of seeing them leave it forever, which causes them to die in great pain. And I have heard traders who trade in Negroes tell me that more of them die before leaving port than during the voyage. Some throwing themselves into the sea, others beating their heads against the vessel, others holding their breath to suffocate, and others not wanting to eat, to starve themselves to death. And when they have lost sight of their country, they begin to console themselves, and especially when regaled with the harmony of some instrument. This is why it would be good for the preservation of the Negroes to make them dance and keep them cheerful along the way. make them dance and keep them cheerful. For it is a good way to transport them in health. And when they are exposed for sale, they are always sold more when those who buy them see them cheerful and jolly. As this extract suggests, involvement in the slave trade gave rise to some hesitation and debate. From the outset, the frequency of slave suicide served to question the humanity and immorality of the trade. The frequency of self-destruction revealed the humanity of the captive, who were presented as sentient beings with a recognized attachment to their homeland. But these doubts were immediately swept aside by the traditional justification, religious justification of the slave trade and slavery. Savary also seemed to believe that playing a violin could alleviate the heartbreak felt by the captives, the aim is in a case being not so much to improve their lot as to make the most of it. The incredible process of denial of the suffering caused by enslavement, on which the Atlantic system of slavery was founded, was thus immediately put in place. The captives, momentarily considered as suffering subjects, were quickly reduced to quasi-animals that could be easily soothed and domesticated to the sound of music. Half a century later, in 1723, le Dictionnaire universel du commerce appeared. It was a work begun by Jacques Savary des Brulons and completed by Philémon Louis Savary, two of Jacques Savary's sons. An alphabetic list of all goods subject to custom duty, it included an article on Negroes, which borrowed from their father's manual, with slight modification, the paragraph on slave suicide on board slave ships. The dictionary was a second bestseller in the Ars Mercatoria in France and Europe. The article on Negroes was plagiarized repeatedly throughout the 18th century. And the passage on the slave trade in Mayol's tale is almost certainly a reference to it. The frequency of suicide in the slave trade also became a commonplace in travel accounts to Africa. Most of them explain their suicide by the prejudices of the captives themselves. The repetition of these tropes, which places the causes of this suicide in enslaved people themselves, was a way of proving their inferiority and putting at bay any doubts about the immorality of the slave trade. In the journal of his voyage to Africa and Barbados, made in 1693-1694 and published in 1732 in the Churchill Brothers collection of travelogues, Captain Thomas Philip recounted that, for instance, the Negroes are so willful and love to leave their own country that they have often leaped out of the canoes, boat, and ship into the sea and kept under till they were drowned to avoid being taken and saved by our boats which pursued them. We had about 12 Negroes did willfully drown themselves and others starved themselves to death. For this, they believe that when they die, they return home to their own country and friends again. The belief in metempsychosis was put forward very early on to make sense of slave suicide. Nowadays, American historiography still tends to take at face value what is seen as an Africanism. The problem is that what can be reconstructed of the relations between West African societies and suicide shows that it was in fact very similar to that of European societies at the time. Apart from suicide of honor reserved to the elites, voluntary death was a very strong social taboo. The corpses of suicides were likewise abused to prevent the spirits of those who had inflicted a bad death on themselves from coming back to haunt the living. This repulsive view of suicide is difficult to reconcile with the belief which may have originated in the slave trade, in the transmigration of spirits back to Africa, making voluntary death a positive act to be sought. The importance of slave suicide was also a commonplace in the travelogues to the English and French Caribbean. In one of the earliest accounts to the West Indies, published in 1657, Richard Ligon recounted how his friend Colonel Humphrey Walrond, a prominent planter, put an end to a series of hangings among his enslaved laborers by placing their severed heads on pikes for all to see. The lack of proper burial of the head was supposed to prevent transmigration to Africa. As late as 1722, the Dominican Jean-Baptiste Lapa reported many similar anecdotes in his Nouveau Voyage aux Îles. It was the stories of suicide in particular that made his work one of the most widely read, plagiarized, and quoted accounts throughout the 18th century. Michel Duché was one of the first to show that these travel accounts to Africa and the Americas were part of the libraries of the Enlightenment philosophers and naturalists. The question now is what the Enlightenment writers made of this information on slave suicide, which came from sources that clearly promoted and defended slavery and reflected an early racialization of enslaved Africans. Let's start by looking at the Enlightenment debate on suicide from this perspective. As self-destruction was then traditionally viewed as the worst crime and sin and could be violently punished, the Enlightenment writers were mainly concerned with the morality of the phenomenon. This was considered in terms of the individual's relationship to God, nature, and society. Do human beings belong to God or to themselves? Does suicide go against the law and instincts of nature? Does suicide constitute a breach of the social contract? It was possible to answer this question theoretically, and this is what most of the authors involved in the controversy did. However, they could not completely ignore the fact that voluntary death was not only a theoretical question. Their debate was in fact a response to the feeling that acts of suicide were on the increase in European societies. It was also based on the observation that normalized suicide practices existed in other societies throughout time and space. However, not all civilization and culture were taken into account in these histories of suicide. Take, for example, this passage, this excerpt from the Système de la Nature by le Baron d'Holbach, one of the most radical defenders of the right to kill oneself. Man in different ages, in different countries, has formed opinion extremely various upon the conduct of those who have had the temerity to put an end to their own existence. His ideas upon the subjects, as upon all others, have taken their tone from his religion, have been governed by his superstitious system, have been modified by his political institutions. The Greeks, the Romans, and other nations, which everything conspired to make intrepid, to render courageous, to lead to magnanimity, regarded as heroes, contemplated as gods, those who voluntarily cut the thread of life. In Hindustan, the Brahmin yet knows how to inspire even women with sufficient fortitude to burn themselves upon the dead bodies of their husband. The Japanese, upon the most trifling occasion, takes no kind of difficulty in plunging a dagger in his bosom. This excerpt reveals a focus on Greco-Roman antiquity and on Asia, with the female practice that the British were to call sati in India, as well as suicide of honor in Japan. Voltaire, who had a much more nuanced view of voluntary death than le Baron d'Holbach, mobilized the same context when he examined suicide laws around the world in the entry entitled Cato on Suicide in his Dictionnaire philosophique published in 1764. There were exceptions, however. Alongside Cato or Lucretia, Indian widows, and disgraced Japanese, some authors chose to include enslaved Native Americans and Africans in their history of suicide through space and time. In fact, John Donne, who wrote the first essay entirely devoted to suicide in England in 1610, in which he sought to demonstrate that self-homicide was not against the law of nature, mentioned the mass suicide of indigenous people in Spanish America as a consequence of the law authorizing the enslavement of anthropophagous natives. At the time of the Enlightenment, when the transatlantic slave trade was beginning to take on considerable proportions, it was Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis who was one of the first and one of the few philosophers to take into account of slave suicide on slave ships. Unlike Donne, Maupertuis took a resolute anti-suicide stance in essay of son essai de philosophie morale published in 1751. Within the framework of Christianity, voluntary death could only be condemned from a moral point of view. But outside Christianity, the philosopher accepted that individuals could be motivated to kill themselves for reasons of high moral value. In the chapter devoted to the system of the Stoics, he pointed out that not only had the Stoics been able to live according to their principles, but that other people were equally capable of braving pain and death. So I will focus on the lines about enslaved people. Others whom we hardly regard as men and whom we treat like horses and oxen, as soon as the burden of life takes hold of them, know how to end it. A ship returning from Guinea is full of Catos who would rather die than outlive their freedom. Here are all nations that have reached all the most terrible things that the Stoic prescribed. This is what opinion and custom can do. Let us not doubt that the reasoning as such has much force. Let us not even distinguish custom and opinion from reasoning. They are undoubtedly reasonings, only less thorough. The Negro and the philosopher have but one object, to make their hope of another life solely occupied with making their condition better. The striking comparison with Cato, the great figure of heroic suicide inspired by Stoicism in the 18th century, meant that slave suicide were, for Maupertuis, not simply acts of despair in the face of fear and suffering, but a reasoned choice that reflected a principled rejection of slavery. Suicide thus became the act by which men and women, animalized by slavery, proclaimed their humanity. The rapprochement between the Negro and the philosopher, as in the later tale of Mayol, also helped to elevate them morally. Maupertuis had nevertheless contributed to the debate on the color of blacks by being one of the first to argue, based on the existence of albinos, that whites were the original race from which blacks had degenerated. However, this passage from Maupertuis' essay on moral philosophy was not always read as morally uplifting for enslaved Africans. In his critical and philosophical history of suicide, published in 1761, the Neapolitan philosopher Appiano Buonafede reviewed the philosophical religion and the philosophical and religious system authorizing voluntary death. In the first chapter entitled Suicide Among the Orientals, Africans and Celts, he wrote, "As far as the present state of Africa is concerned, there's nothing worth reporting. These regions are now populated in part by Christian, Hebrews, and Turks, and by savages or barbarians. Some do not kill themselves, the others are deprived of religion and philosophy. So that if they do commit suicide, which sometimes happens, they are not acting out of any false system, but without principle and without discernment. This is why we think it's unnecessary to deal with them." We know that Maupertuis, who is often singular in his ideas, compared the suicide of the slave from Guinea to the reason and stoical death of Cato. But he probably only made this comparison to amuse his readers. Buenefede went much further than the travel accounts on which he claimed to rely, denying sub-Saharan Africans any philosophy or even religion. Surprisingly, he made no reference to the belief in metempsychosis held by Africans who did not follow one of the three religions of the book. Despite his extreme position, rather than simply ignoring Africa and Africans, he felt obliged to justify their omission from his universal history by reinterpreting Maupertuis' famous passage in the wrong way. In 1770, Jean-Baptiste Claude de l'Isle de Sales published De la philosophie de la nature, presenting his work as a refutation of the Baron d'Holbach's system de la nature. In comparison with Maupertuis, he defended a resolutely anti-slavery position while condemning voluntary death in principle. It was one of the few works to take part in both the debate on suicide and that on slavery, in both cases referring to slave suicide. In the article entitled On Negroes, in the second part of the volume 4, after devoting a long section to the question of their color, de l'Isle de Sales include a memoir that he had supposedly translated from the African language and that had been sent to the British Parliament by a Senegalese to plead against slavery. The text described the suffering imposed by slave exploitation. But instead of presenting suicide as a response to this mistreatment, the enslaved man insists that they are preventing from killing themselves. Not to spare us from crimes, I quote, but to have the power to do them, to commit crime. Therefore, it was in the article entitled History of the Famous Suicide, in the chapter on suicide in the second part of volume 5, that de l'Isle de Sales emphasized that colonization gave rise to numerous acts of voluntary death. He begins by mentioning the famous self-killings of Greco-Roman antiquity, then after asserting that, I quote, the contagion of suicide has circled the globe, the polygraph turned toward the region of the world immediately after mentioning honor self-killing in Japan, he states, and I'm not going to read the quotation because I think I'm very late already, so de l'Isle de Sales attributes the epidemic of suicide among enslaved Native Americans and Africans to colonial and slave oppression. But he seemed to explain their action only in terms of a desire to escape extreme suffering and not like Maupertuis in terms of a reasoned rejection of slavery and a claim to honor. Moreover, it tries to recall the idea that Africans kill themselves by choking on their tongue, a practice presented as being peculiar to them since time immemorial, which tends to make it a racial attribute. But his criticism of colonial expansion leads him to present the epidemic of suicide that supposedly began in England before spreading to the rest of Europe as a just punishment of the colonizer for their misdeeds. Hence, he held Europe's most important trading power responsible for the globalization of suicide, which is seen as in pathological terms as the word epidemic is used repeatedly. How can we make sense of this inclusion or more frequently exclusion of slave suicide from the reflection of Enlightenment philosopher on voluntary death throughout the world. The reason is not to be found in the position of on slavery, since D'Holbach and Voltaire, like Delille de Sales, condemned slavery. As for the position on suicide, the criterion is not hostility to self-destruction or its apology. Rather, as Robert Favre points out, among those who defend suicide, whether absolutely or circumstantially, I quote, the arguments oscillate between two extremes. The naturalist interpretation, which reduces this event to an insignificant fact within the universe in which man is immersed, and the humanist interpretation, which sees man as assuming, through these glorious acts, sovereign control over his destiny. End of quote. D'Holbach is on the side of the first extreme. Moreover, he considered that most human beings are not freer in death than in life. Hence, perhaps his silence on slave suicide. Maupertuis is situated on the other side, like Delille de Sales, even though Delille de Sales does not read slave suicide in the same heroic way as Maupertuis, perhaps because of his racial view of them. In his article on the Negroes, he insists on the degrading effects of climate on their anatomy and particularly on their brains, hence their alleged natural, I quote, stupidity. More generally, race thinking doubly played some role in whether or not slave suicide were taken into account and in the ways in which they were considered. Having discussed slave suicide in essays and treatises on voluntary death, let us now examine what was said about them in a whole series of novels and plays whose hero was an enslaved African prince and which took part in the debate on the slave trade and slavery. Although informed by what travel accounts had to say about the frequency of slave suicide, most of the novels and plays whose main character was an enslaved African prince paradoxically chose to prevent their hero from killing himself. The original figure is Oronuko, whose story Afra Benz tells, presented as true in a novel set in Suriname, where the author stayed in 1663-1664. Published in 1688, the work was a huge publishing success during the Enlightenment, in both its theatrical and novel form, and in both its French and English versions. It's therefore hardly surprising that the story of the runaway in Suriname in Candide is probably reminiscent of Oronuko. After Antoine de Laplace translated the novel into French in 1745, other French-speaking novelists took up the character and story of the Black Prince in the second half of the 18th century. Jean-François de Saint-Lambert with Ziméo, Jean-François Butigny with ses lettres africaines ou Histoire de Fédima et d'Abinsart, and Joseph Lavallée with Le Nègre comme il y a peu de blancs. Researchers who have studied Oronuko and its avatars have focused primarily on the representation of the rebellious or runaway enslaved men and less often on the fact that suicide is a common thread running through these literary works. It should be emphasized that Oronuko and his double are exceptional figures. Not only do they stand out by virtue of their birth and social status, but they have also benefited from the education of Europeans. This degree of civilization is reflected in Oronuko's physical appearance. He often resembles a black Adonis. It also informs his choice to remain monogamous, a promise he systematically makes to his beloved. This is important because the question of suicide is as much linked to the slave condition as it is to the love relationships in this works. It's clear that from the author's point of view, in order to individualize an enslaved African, make him the hero of a novel, and confront the character with the issue of suicide, he had to be morally elevated and therefore de-Africanized. The temptation to commit suicide appears many times throughout the plot between Africa and America and sometimes Europe. But the variation in the way voluntary death is summed up in one novel to the next give them different meaning. One point in common is the mention of the frequency of suicidal acts on board slave ships, so that it's necessary to explain why the hero does not kill himself during the Middle Passage. On the other hand, while revolt is always presented as inseparable from suicide, the choice of whether or not to allow the hero to commit suicide in the colony at the end of the story shed light on the author's position on slavery. And in fact, except in the adaptation of Afraben's novel, they are impeded to kill themselves. But I won't dwell on this because I'm running out of time. Interestingly, two of these novels also include discussion on the morality of suicide. I will insist on Lavallee's novel, which was published 3 times, immediately adapted for the stage and translated into English twice. The plot takes place between Senegal, Saint-Domingue, and Paris, and the narrator is not a European, but Itanako, that's the name of Oronuko in the novel, himself. In Saint-Domingue, Itanako finds himself in prison with his faithful companion Autourou. They are wrongly accused of murdering a white man and face the death penalty. Autourou suggests they commit suicide. What follows is a dialogue that cannot be understood without taking into account the fact that in Senegal, Itanako was not only educated by Europeans, but also instructed in the Christian religion. I'm going just to read the last sentence. See what you propose to me, to kill ourselves, it's to be criminal toward God, toward men, toward ourselves. At the end of Itanako's plea against suicide, which is much longer than the quote, it goes on several pages, Autourou gives up the idea of killing himself. The exoneration and release of the 2 companions, thanks to their white friends, is followed by a religious ceremony during which Autourou is baptized. Not only that this marks the second time that a novel about colonial slavery has taken part in the debate on suicide, but it also links the position it takes against the morality of voluntary death to a commentary on the reality of suicide among enslaved people. After Autourou's injunction, "Let us die," a long footnote is added by Lavallee, in which the author, Lavallee, relates the frequency of suicide among enslaved people, which he links to their belief in the possibility of returning to their homeland after death, and therefore, in his opinion, to the failure of their evangelization to extirpate this false prejudice from his mind. He also mentioned the numerous stories of slave self-killings in Labat Traveler's account and chose to tell one at length. Faced with an epidemic of suicide on his plantation in St. Kitts, the Major Crisp threatened his enslaved laborers to hang himself and go and open a plantation in Africa where he would have them work. Thanks to this spiritual manipulation, he allegedly succeeded in stopping self-destruction among them. Both the method, making the sources of the fiction visible, and the stand taken in favor of the immorality of suicide, are indicative of Lavallee's project as set out in the preface. I quote, "To make blacks loved, and to show their virtues not in a novel, but in," I quote, "the history of a national character composed of traits taken from the lives of different Negroes," end of quote. This claim to realism makes the ventriloquism that a white author like Lavallee achieves by giving voice to his black hero even more violent. Even though he's perfectly aware of the importance of voluntary death in the slave trade and slavery, his novel is the story of a slave suicide that was stopped. Because he believes that it's a necessary condition for imposing the abolition of slavery, Lavallée wants to make black laws on condition that they become Christian and civilized. He Africanized and therefore racialized slave suicide and is unable to link them to the oppression they suffer. According to Yumna Sharara, the emergence and proliferation of this colonial fiction in the second half of the 18th century would not have been possible without the development on a broader debate on the slave trade and slavery. In France, apart from Montesquieu, the spirit of the laws, two collective works play a major role in launching the controversy. The Encyclopédie and l'Histoire des deux Indes, History of the two Indes. Between the two works, the relationship established between suicide and slavery was reversed. The frequency of suicide in the slave trade and slavery is mentioned in both texts, but in the first, it serves only to underline the extreme otherness of the culture of enslaved Africans, whereas in the Histoire des deux Indes, it's intended primarily to denounce the Atlantic system of slavery. I'm not going, unfortunately, to analyze in detail the way suicide are mentioned in both texts. I would only finish with these two works by saying that, by focusing on the Histoire des deux Indes and saying that the Histoire des deux Indes puts slave suicide and revolt in tension. On the one hand, in the last edition, because slave suicide were proof of the immorality of slavery, Diderot did not condemn them on a moral basis, even though he supported the immorality of voluntary death, since man does not belong to himself and has a duty to preserve his life. On the other hand, in the first two editions, Pechmeja ultimately defended the right to resist oppression in the name of the moral duty to preserve one's freedom and life, even seeming to present revolt as the legitimate form that resistance by enslaved people should take rather than suicide. But what these thinkers completely missed in their moral outrage against slavery was that for enslaved people in a position of structural weakness, despite their demographic majority, revolt was always a form of suicide. With so little chance of success, it necessarily implied the acceptance of voluntary death. At the same time as the three successive editions of the Histoire des deux Indes were being published, three works belonging to different genres appeared that play an important role in the transition from an anti-slavery stance to abolitionism in France. They confirm that the French abolitionists, while not neglecting the argument of self-destruction as a sign of slaves' suffering, were more often than not reluctant to read slave suicide as heroic acts. Jacques-Henri Bernardin de Saint-Pierre is the only major writer of the Enlightenment who lived in some slave societies. He spent 3 years in the Mascarene Islands. 2 years later, after his voyage, he published a travel account in 1773. Without explicitly calling for the abolition, he wrote in the postscript to the narrative entitled Reflection on Slavery that he was, I quote, annoyed that philosophers who fight abuses so courageously have hardly spoken of black slavery except to joke about it, end of quote. In letter 12 of his travel account entitled On the Blacks, he had previously emphasized the propensity for despair and the frequency of suicide among enslaved people, along with the forms of resistance. However, the themes of suicide and slavery are intertwined and with extreme ambiguity in his novel entitled Paul and Virginie. published in 1788, even though the work, set in present-day Mauritius, is considered to be one of the great sentimental novels of the 18th century, featuring a suicide and an important abolitionist plea. After Candide, Paul et Virginie offers another famous scene with a runaway, but this time female. Few scholars have noticed that when the runaway woman comes to take refuge with Virginie, then aged around 10, she gives her the following explanation. My good young lady, have pity on a poor runaway slave. For a whole month I have wandered among this mountain, half deaf with anger, and often pursued by the hunters and their dogs. I fled from my master, a rich planter of the Black River, who has used me as you see. And she showed a body marked with scars from the lashes she had received. She added, I was going to drown myself, but hearing you lived here, I say to myself, since there are still some good white people in this country, I need not die yet. The episode in which suicide is used to measure the acceptability of slavery thus supports the existence of good masters and tolerable form of slavery. When Candide simply wept at the speech made by the runaway from Suriname, Virginie, even though she was still a child, helped the wretched woman and gave her food, but managed to convince her to return to her owner by telling her that she would ask for a pardon, which the master granted. But the reader then learns that the enslaved woman has in fact been very severely punished. This prevented drowning must be contrasted with Virginie's tragic death on her return from France at the end of the novel. A ship was caught in a storm off Mauritius, and out of modesty, she chose not to undress and so drowned. The sublime is therefore associated with the young white woman who refuses to expose her body and finds happiness in death, and not with the black enslaved woman whose battered body has been exhibited and who is condemned to suffer endlessly. In the last words she said to Paul before sinking, Virginie argues that she has, I quote, escaped forever from poverty, slander, storms, the spectacle of other people's pain, end of quote. Disappearing before she could even return to the land of slavery, the novel's heroine is the observer of slavery, not its victim. The suicide that gives the novel its meaning has its origin in the desire to preserve virginal modesty rather than in the affirmation of human freedom. A Voyage to the Island of Mauritius was presented by the Marquis de Condorcet in his Reflection on Negro Slavery, published under a pen name in 1781. As one, I quote, of the works in which the way in which Negroes are treated is more truthfully exposed, end of quote. With his reflection on Negro slavery, Condorcet stands out as the only great philosopher of the Enlightenment to have devoted a work specifically and exclusively to the subject. His aim was not to produce a theoretical text, but to raise public awareness, respond to the defenders of slavery, and propose a plan for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. In the book, suicide appears to be a recurring reality in both the slave trade and slavery, without ever being associated with the African culture of the enslaved. Along with escapes and infanticide, they are presented as one of the causes of the depopulation of plantations in response to the avarice and cruelty of the evil masters. In the 12th chapter, which challenges the argument of the defenders of slavery, and in particular, the common view that freedom meant nothing to enslaved people and that they were happier than European peasants, Condorcet once again highlights the prevalence of suicide while introducing a concession. No doubt a Negro will not kill himself like Cato. in order not to be obliged to obey Caesar. But the Negro will kill himself because his master separates him in spite of himself from the woman he loves, because he forces him to give herself up to himself, because following the example of old Cato, he prostitutes her for money. The Negro miss their festival, their dances, their laziness, the freedom to indulge in tastes and habits of their homeland. The gap between Maupertuis and Delisle de Sales in the debate on suicide reappears here. Condorcet goes on to explain that enslaved Africans were not driven by a love of political freedom, but by, I quote, a different kind of freedom that had more to do with a desire for autonomy in daily life. He did not consider enslaved Africans to be naturally inferior, but he did believe that slavery had degraded them morally. Like the third edition of the History of the Two Indies, he put forward their alleged, I quote, great stupidity to justify his proposal for a very gradualist end to slavery. In 1788, Condorcet took part in the creation of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks and published a second edition of his reflection. But the combined effects of the revolution in mainland France and Saint-Domingue brought the debates on the slave trade and slavery to an early halt in the National Assembly in the autumn of 1791. At the same time, the adoption of the Penal Code made it possible to decriminalize suicide on the sly without any discussion by excluding it from the list of acts considered to be crimes. Even if it was concealed, the decriminalization of suicide seemed obvious to French revolutionaries, whereas the abolition of the slave trade and slavery was not immediately imposed after the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789, and would probably not have taken place without the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue. To conclude, I would like to offer a paradoxical suggestion. It's perhaps because the debates on suicide and slavery intersected more than might have imagined at first, that the French philosophers of the Enlightenment made only moderate use of the arguments of slave suicide to denounce the slave trade and slavery, and counter one of the main arguments of the enslavers, according to whom enslaved people were happier in the Americas. To understand this view, one at first remember two interrelated facts. The proposal to reform and to abolish slavery were seen in a continuum, and the position on slavery and that on race did not conflate. Indeed, race thinking was supported by both defenders of slavery and anti-slavery writers. Hence, French Enlightenment authors interpreted slave suicide in very different ways. They did not all use the enslavers' main excuse to absolve themselves of any responsibility by associating slave suicide only with particularities of African culture. Likewise, only a few contributed to the discourse developed by enslavers on their power to prevent and stop what was seen as act of resistance. Indeed, most opponents to slavery saw the prevalence of voluntary death as a sign of the extreme suffering of enslaved people and linked it to the oppression they suffered. But moral judgments about enslaved Africans and their racialization usually prevented them from being associated with heroic suicide, the only ones that this philosopher deemed acceptable. Entangled in the moral debate on suicide, these writers were also unable to propose a sociological reading of the phenomenon. The racialization at work in their writing took various forms, both conscious and unconscious, and paradoxically can be found in authors who actively participate in the development of racial theories, as well as in those who claim to be anti-racist. But what they had in common was that most of them denied enslaved people the possibility of asserting themselves as political subjects by choosing liberty or death. I do not wish to suggest that this is the only way historians should view slave suicide. My forthcoming book will seek to offer a sociological and anthropological interpretation of the phenomenon. The fact remains that this is the political conception that the Enlightenment imposed. Thank you.